Hi, how are you? Let me ask you something. Have you ever gone through moments where you felt like no one cared about you? Maybe you tried your best, gave it your all, and yet you were ignored, rejected, or even forgotten. I want you to know something. This is not the end. In fact, many times these moments of rejection are the beginning of something great that God is preparing for you. Today, I want to talk to you about the transformative power of God. He is the one who takes those who are overlooked and places them in the highest positions. Can you imagine this being your story? Maybe you don't see it now, but I'll show you how God works. And believe me, He does work. Stay with me until the end, because you'll understand that every moment of pain or rejection might be leading you to something much greater. You are not here by accident, and God has something to say to you today. For us to understand how God works in the lives of those He chooses, we need to look at the Bible. Do you know why? Because there, we find stories of people who were rejected, forgotten, and yet God turned everything around and used them in incredible ways. And this shows that what He did in the past, He can do in your life too. Let's start with a powerful verse from Psalm 118, verse 22, which says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Do you know what this means? That what was discarded, what no one thought was important, became the foundation. This is how God works. He takes those who are at the bottom, who have been cast aside, and does something amazing. A clear example of this is David. Have you heard of him? When the prophet Samuel went to Jesse's house to choose a new king for Israel, do you know what happened? Jesse presented all his sons except David. He was out in the field tending the sheep, while the others were seen as more important. But God looked at him, the most unlikely one, and said, "This is the one I've chosen." 1 Samuel 16:7. David was rejected by his own family, but God exalted him as the greatest king of Israel. And what about Joseph's story? He was Jacob's beloved son, but his brothers envied him and sold him as a slave. Can you imagine the pain of that? Joseph ended up in Egypt, spent years being humiliated, forgotten in prison. But do you know what happened? God was at work. At the right time, Joseph was made governor of Egypt, the second most powerful man in the land. God took the rejection he suffered and turned it into exaltation. This is recorded in Genesis 50:20, where Joseph says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." If we think about it, it seems like rejection is a piece of God's puzzle, not because He enjoys seeing us suffer, but because He knows what's coming. He uses these situations to shape our character, to prepare us for something greater. It's like a diamond that needs to be polished before it can shine. So, if you're feeling rejected today, remember this: God doesn't forget anyone. The rejection you're facing might just be the beginning of a great work He is about to do in your life. Trust Him. Stay strong. Life has a strange way of making us feel rejected. Sometimes it feels like nothing we do is enough. But what we forget is that God sees everything, even when no one else does. He knows our hearts, understands our intentions, and most importantly, knows what He is preparing for our future. Think about David. He was just a boy tending sheep, forgotten by his own family, while his brothers were seen as the strong and capable ones. But God doesn't look at appearances. He looks at the heart. While everyone ignored David, God was preparing the right moment to exalt him, and that's exactly what happened. David, who no one thought much of, was anointed as king. Now tell me, doesn't that give you hope? Doesn't it make you think that God also has a plan for your life, even if no one sees your worth right now? And what about Joseph's incredible story? Imagine the pain of being betrayed by your own brothers, sold as a slave, treated as nothing. It's so unjust. Joseph could have given up, lost his faith, but he stayed strong. He knew God wasn't done writing his story. And do you know what happened? God used every difficult situation to take Joseph to the place He wanted him to be, from slave to governor. What seemed like the end of the road was, in fact, the beginning of something great. The truth is that many times the rejection we face is part of a process. It's not easy to understand when we're in the middle of it. The pain blinds us, but it's like a seed that needs to be buried to grow. At that moment, it feels like it's over, like it's the end. But what's actually happening is the opposite. The seed is preparing to sprout, to bloom. That's how God works. He turns what was contempt into honor. He takes those who were ignored and makes them shine. Now think about your own life. Maybe you've gone through something similar, a lost job, a friendship that disappointed you, or even family situations that made you feel like you didn't matter. But I want to remind you of something. God doesn't make mistakes. If He allowed you to go through this, it's because He has something greater ahead. It might not make sense now, but trust Him. If we think about it, the stories of David, Joseph, and so many others reveal something very important. God always works in silence. While people focus only on what's visible on the surface, God sees everything. When Joseph was in prison, he couldn't imagine that God was preparing the perfect stage to make him the governor of Egypt. When David was being rejected, he didn't know that God had already chosen him as king. And do you know what these stories have in common? They teach us that the place we are in today doesn't define where we'll be tomorrow. Sometimes rejection is like a necessary pause for God to adjust everything. Look at this. If Joseph had stayed at his father's house, he would never have gone to Egypt. And if he hadn't gone to Egypt, he wouldn't have been able to save his entire family from famine. It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes the path to purpose is full of twists and obstacles. Yet every step is part of the plan. Here's the main point. You are also in this process. Maybe today you feel like David, forgotten, or like Joseph, treated unfairly. Maybe you look around and ask yourself, God, why is this happening to me? Why doesn't anyone value me? The truth is, God values you. He sees you and knows you better than anyone else. What may seem like rejection now could be the preparation you need to achieve something you can't yet imagine. Think with me. How do we grow? How do we learn to trust God more? Usually, it's in the tough moments. When everything is going well, it's easy to forget to seek His presence. But when we face rejection, sadness, or challenges, that's when our faith is strengthened. That's where God shapes us. And do you know something else? Often, the very people who rejected you will be the ones amazed at what God will do in your life. Joseph was sold by his own brothers, but in the end, he was the one who saved their lives. David was overlooked, but later his own family saw him anointed as king. This shows us that when God decides to exalt someone, nothing and no one can stop it. Now, think about this. What is God preparing in your life while you face these difficulties? He's shaping you, strengthening your faith, teaching you to trust. It's not easy, but it's necessary. And believe me, when the right time comes, He will place you in a position where everyone will see what He has done for you. Looking at all of this, we notice a pattern. God uses rejection to build strength, but more than that, He uses time. And here comes one of the hardest parts: waiting. It's not easy, is it? Because often waiting feels like silence. It feels like nothing is happening, that God isn't listening. But the truth is, while you're waiting, He is working. He's not only preparing the way, but also preparing you. Imagine if Joseph had been released from prison too soon. He might not have been ready to govern. Or if David had taken the throne right after being anointed. He needed to go through challenges and battles to become the king God intended him to be. And it's no different with you. During this waiting period, God is building something within you. This building process is just as important as the final destination. Think of a tall building. The higher it is, the deeper its foundation needs to be. If the foundation isn't strong, the building will collapse. In the same way, God is strengthening your foundation during this waiting period. He is preparing you to bear the weight of the blessings that will come. And there's more. What God does in someone's life is never just for that person. There's always a bigger purpose. Look at Joseph's case. It wasn't just about him. It was about saving an entire nation from famine. David, it wasn't just about being king. It was about leading Israel and pointing to the future Messiah. So you can be sure that what God is doing in your life is not just for you. He wants to use you to impact others, to bring hope, to be a light where there's only darkness. And here's the most amazing part. When God exalts you, He does it in a way that no one can deny. It's as if He's saying, "Look at this. See what I can do in the life of someone who trusts in me." And at that moment, you realize that every tear, every rejection, every day of waiting was worth it. There's something interesting that we sometimes overlook: the way God works in silence. While the world is concerned with appearances and immediate results, God is looking at the heart, at the essence. He's in no rush because He knows exactly what He's doing. But what challenges us is that during this silence, we often question, have I been forgotten? The truth is, God never forgets. He sees every detail, even the ones that seem small and insignificant. Here's an example. Think of a plant growing. The most important moment is not when it blooms, but when its roots are strengthening underground. No one sees it, but that's where the foundation is being formed. If you're in a season where it feels like nothing is happening, maybe this is the moment when God is strengthening your roots. Another thing we learn from these stories of rejection is that God calls us to something greater than we can imagine. Often we think small. We just want to solve the immediate problem, escape the pain, or overcome the rejection. But God's plans go far beyond that. He doesn't just want you to be healed. He wants you to be an instrument of healing. He doesn't just want you to be blessed. He wants you to be a blessing in the lives of others. And do you know what's even more interesting? God usually uses the very places where we were hurt to make us strong. Joseph was rejected by his family, but in the end, he was the one who restored unity to his household. David was underestimated, yet he became an inspiration to an entire nation. The place where we feel the most pain can be the very place where God performs the greatest miracle. Isn't that incredible? Another point to consider is that the exaltation that comes from God is different from anything the world can offer. The world exalts based on merit, appearance, or status. God exalts based on faithfulness, the heart, and purpose. And this kind of exaltation is enduring because it comes from heaven. When God places you in a position, no one can take it away. Now, here's something we need to understand. Not all rejection is negative. Often God allows doors to close because He knows that the place or situation isn't what He planned for you. Sometimes we insist on something that seems good but could actually pull us away from His purpose. It's hard to accept this in the moment because it hurts. But when we look back, it becomes clear. If that door had remained open, you might not have been on the right path. Rejection can be a form of protection. Think about it. What if Joseph hadn't been sold by his brothers? He would have stayed comfortable in his father's house, far from the greater purpose God had for him. The pain of his brother's rejection paved the way for him to be exalted in Egypt. In the same way, God might be protecting you from situations you can't even imagine. Another aspect we often overlook is that during the process, God places people in our path. You know those encounters that seem random but change everything? It could be a friend offering a word of encouragement, an unexpected opportunity, or even someone believing in you when no one else does. God works in the details, and He uses people to propel you forward when you need it most. And what's even more fascinating is how God transforms the meaning of rejection. What was once seen as a weakness or a source of shame, He turns into a reason for honor. Look at the example of Jesus. He was rejected, humiliated, and even crucified. Yet through that rejection came the salvation of all humanity. It's as if God takes the pain and converts it into something so extraordinary that its meaning completely changes. This leads us to another lesson, the importance of trusting God's timing. Exaltation doesn't come when we want it, but when we are ready. If Joseph had been exalted too soon, he wouldn't have been prepared to lead. If David had taken the throne immediately, he wouldn't have had the wisdom to govern. God knows exactly the right moment to act, and while we wait, He works both in us and around us. One thing that almost no one notices is that during these processes of rejection and waiting, God isn't just preparing you. He's also preparing the stage around you. Imagine a theater before a big performance. The curtains are still closed, but the actors are rehearsing. The lights are being adjusted, and the instruments are being tuned. It looks like nothing is happening, but in reality, everything is being carefully organized for the moment the curtains open. That's how it is with God. He doesn't just shape you, but also aligns all the pieces of your life's puzzle. Joseph, for example, couldn't have become governor if Egypt wasn't facing a crisis. David couldn't have become king if the people didn't need a different kind of leader. So what often seems like a delay is really just God putting everything in its rightful place. Another important point is that rejection teaches us to depend less on others' opinions and more on God. When we are accepted by everyone, there's a danger of seeking validation only from people. But rejection forces us to look upward. It reminds us that in the end, what truly matters is what God thinks about us. This trust in God is essential because it sustains us when we face even greater challenges in the future. Now, do you know what's amazing about this whole process? It's that God makes a point of using ordinary people. He doesn't choose those who are already at the top, those the world deems perfect. He chooses the unlikely, the ones no one notices. Why? Because that's how he demonstrates his power. If it were based on human merit, people would credit the glory to man. But when God takes someone who was rejected and transforms them, it's clear that the work is his. And this brings us to another point. God never wastes an experience. Every pain, every tear, every moment of rejection has a purpose. Nothing is in vain. Even the mistakes we make can be used by God to teach us, strengthen us, and guide us. He is an expert in turning bad situations into valuable lessons. That's why it's important not to hold on to grudges or resentment. When Joseph reunited with his brothers, he had the chance to seek revenge, but he chose to forgive because he understood that everything that had happened was part of God's plan. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's liberating. And when you release forgiveness, you make room for God to do even more in your life. Now, there's something hard but essential dealing with comparison. When we're in a moment of rejection or waiting, it's natural to look around and think, why does that person's life seem to be working out while mine isn't? Comparison is a trap because it makes us forget that each person has a unique purpose and timeline. What God is doing in your life cannot be compared to what he is doing in someone else's. Think about David again. While his brothers were in front of the prophet being presented, he was out in the field alone. He could have gotten upset and asked, why do they get this opportunity and I don't? But David stayed where God placed him at that moment. And it was precisely because of that faithfulness that when the right time came, he was ready. Another important point is that God works on our identity during these moments. Rejection often tries to convince us that we're not good enough, but God uses these situations to remind us who we really are in him. You are not defined by the rejection you faced or by the labels others have put on you. Your identity comes from God, and he sees you as a masterpiece, someone of immense value. It's also interesting to note how rejection teaches us empathy. When we go through pain and challenges, we become more sensitive to others' struggles. Joseph, for example, knew what it was like to be forgotten and rejected, so when he had the chance to help, he didn't hesitate. God uses our experiences to mold us into more compassionate people, better prepared to help those around us. And you know what else? Many times the challenges we face are God's school. He teaches us patience, humility, and perseverance. Look at Moses' life. He spent 40 years in the desert before being called to lead the people of Israel. During that time, God was working in him, teaching him leadership and total dependence on him. And when the time came, Moses was ready. This is why we should never underestimate the value of processes. Every day of waiting, every tear shed, every silent prayer has a purpose. God doesn't waste anything. What he is doing in you today is the foundation for what he will do through you tomorrow. One of the most incredible things about how God works is the element of surprise. He doesn't follow human logic or the paths we imagine. When everything seems lost, that's when he acts in unexpected ways. God loves to defy expectations. Remember Gideon? He was the least in his tribe, from an insignificant family, yet he was chosen to lead Israel against the Midianites. And do you know what else? God reduced Gideon's army from thousands to just 300 men to show that the victory wouldn't come from human strength, but from his power. And that's how it works in our lives too. Sometimes we feel like we lack resources, strength, or a way out. But God acts in those moments to make it clear that the victory comes from him. It's when we acknowledge our limitations that he can show the greatness of what he's capable of. When we feel weak, he becomes our strength. Another powerful aspect is the restoration God brings after a period of rejection. He doesn't just lift you back up, he places you in an even better position than before. It's like an artisan who takes a broken vase and not only repairs it, but transforms it into something even more beautiful. He doesn't just fix the damage, he creates something new and extraordinary. And this restoration doesn't stay within us. It overflows and touches others. When you go through a difficult moment and God restores you, your story becomes an inspiration to others. Joseph didn't just live the dream God showed him, he became the answer to an entire nation's hunger. What God does in your life doesn't end with you. He uses your story to bless many. One more thing to remember is that in every journey with God, there's a lesson about obedience. Sometimes the rejection we face is God's way of redirecting us to the right path. Maybe we're insisting on something that isn't part of his plan. It's hard to let go of control, but obeying God always leads to better results than we could achieve on our own. Finally, one thing we need to hold on to in our hearts: God never acts hastily, but He is never late. His timing is perfect. Every stage, every apparent delay, every no we receive is part of a greater plan. When we look back and see how everything connects, we understand that God was aligning each piece. Reflecting on all of this, there's something very special about God's silence during moments of waiting and rejection. It's in this silence that He teaches us to hear His voice. Often, we're so surrounded by the noise of our own worries, the opinions of others, and the chaos of daily life that we forget to stop and listen to what He has to say. Rejection, though painful, creates a space where God can speak directly to our hearts. And what He says in these moments often surprises us. He doesn't promise a path without difficulties, but He assures us of His presence. He reminds us that even when it seems like we're alone, He is there, sustaining us. This time of silence is not abandonment. It's an invitation to draw closer to Him. Remember Moses in the desert? He spent 40 years in an arid place, far from everything he knew. But in that desert, he encountered God. The burning bush was the turning point in his life. It was only after this encounter that he could understand the true purpose of his journey. The desert, which seemed like punishment, was actually a time of preparation and intimacy with God. This intimacy is what strengthens us for the challenges to come. When Joseph was called to interpret Pharaoh's dream, he could have taken credit for himself. Instead, he said, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Genesis 41:16. Joseph could only say this because during his years of rejection and loneliness, he learned to trust fully in God. And that's what God wants to do with us. Teach us to depend on Him, to place our trust in Him rather than in our own efforts. Another powerful aspect is how God uses rejection to distance us from things that might limit us. Think about Abraham. God asked him to leave his land, his family, and everything he knew to move toward a promise. This was a rejection of his comfort zone, but by obeying, Abraham stepped into the purpose of becoming the father of many nations. Sometimes we must leave what is familiar to experience the extraordinary that God has prepared. And amid all of this, there's a clear message. God is never in a hurry because He wants to do something well. He is meticulous, careful, and works so that everything contributes to our good. When we're in the middle of the process, it's hard to see this, but when we reach the other side, we understand that every step was necessary. Therefore, instead of seeing rejection as an end, we can view it as the beginning of something God is building. He doesn't abandon us in the process. He walks with us, shapes us, and at the right time, exalts us in a way that no one can deny. And if we think carefully, all these moments of rejection and waiting have one thing in common. They teach us to see the invisible. When everything is going well, we tend to focus only on what's visible, on what's within our reach. But when we face difficulties, we are challenged to look beyond. That's when faith comes into play. Faith, as the Bible says, is the assurance of what we hope for and the conviction of what we do not see. Hebrews 11:1. But how do we learn to have this assurance? It's not when things are easy, but when everything seems to be against us. David, while facing giants, saw God with him. Joseph, in the depths of a prison, envisioned a future that only God could bring about. These men didn't focus on their circumstances, but on the God who was above them. And this vision changes everything. When we look with natural eyes, we see obstacles, rejection, and pain. But with the eyes of faith, we see purpose, growth, and, above all, God's hand guiding every detail. It's like walking through a dark tunnel with the certainty that there's light at the end. That certainty is what keeps us moving forward. Another point worth highlighting is the capacity for renewal that God gives to those who go through these processes. Rejection often causes people to discard or underestimate us, but God is an expert in making us born again, in creating something entirely new out of what seemed to have nothing left. Look at Job's life. He lost everything: family, possessions, health. To human eyes, it was impossible to recover. But God not only restored what Job had lost, He gave him twice as much. And it wasn't just about material possessions. God restored Job's joy, faith, and purpose. This teaches us that what God has for us isn't just compensation for what we lost, but something far greater. And all of this prepares us for an important role, being witnesses to what God can do. It's not just about our personal victory, but about the impact it will have on others' lives. When we share our journey, we inspire people who are going through the same struggles. We become living signs that with God, rejection is never the final point, but the starting point for something extraordinary. Moreover, God always acts in ways that make His glory evident. When He exalts us, it's not just for our benefit, but so that everyone can see His power. Joseph was made governor of Egypt not just to fulfill his own dreams, but to carry out God's plans on a much larger scale. And here's the beauty of God's plan. Even when it seems like we're alone, He is connecting everything, aligning circumstances, shaping our hearts, and preparing something infinitely greater than we could imagine. Another fascinating aspect of how God works is the impact that the process of rejection has on our vision of the future. When we're facing tough times, we often think, will this ever pass? Will I ever get out of this situation? And God's answer is always a resounding yes, but He works on our perception. God not only transforms the present, but teaches us to look toward tomorrow with renewed hope. Think about it. Joseph in Egypt could have settled into his suffering. He could have thought his life would forever be that of a slave or prisoner, but even in the most challenging circumstances, he continued to dream. God gave him the ability to see beyond the present moment. Isn't it amazing how He does the same for us? Even when everything seems to be falling apart, He plants that spark of hope in our hearts, that certainty that better days are coming. What's even more remarkable is that God doesn't just pull us out of suffering. He transforms what seemed like our greatest defeat into a platform for victory. It's as if He says, I'm going to use exactly what was meant to destroy you to show what I can do. That's what happened with Job, with Joseph, and with so many others who trust in Him. Moreover, these moments teach us to deeply value the blessings God gives us. When everything comes easily, we tend to take it for granted, to think we deserve it. But when we go through the process, we learn to recognize that every victory, every blessing is a gift. And this completely changes the way we live. Gratitude becomes an essential part of our daily lives. And you know what's even more incredible? God doesn't just work in the visible. He's always working behind the scenes. Many times we think nothing is happening because we don't see immediate results. But God is aligning things we don't even understand. He's preparing connections, opening doors we can't yet see, and shaping our hearts so that we'll be ready to step into the next stage fully prepared. An example of this is how God surprises us with things we never expected. Have you noticed how He is an expert at showing us that what we planned was too small? Our dreams, as good as they may be, are never as big as His plans. That's why He asks us to trust Him even when we don't understand. He sees the whole picture while we see only one piece of the puzzle. Here's the great truth. His timing is never wasted. Every day, every situation, every tear has a purpose. What may seem like a delay or even a setback is actually part of the journey, leading us to what God has already prepared. As we reach the end of this reflection, we learn that God never wastes a single moment of our lives. Every rejection, every tear, every silence has a purpose. He not only sees what we're going through, but uses these experiences to shape us, strengthen us, and prepare us for something greater. What seems like the end is, in fact, the beginning of a new chapter. When we trust God, we learn that losses become gains, deserts become pathways, and wounds become testimonies. No matter how difficult the process, the exaltation that comes from it is always surprising and transformative. So, stay strong. God hasn't forgotten you. He is working, aligning every detail, and at the right time, you will see that it was all worth it. Trust the God who turns the rejected into the chosen and makes every story a testimony of His power and love.